The steel gate refused to move. A massive iron-reinforced barrier set into stone walls that had been built to withstand artillery, designed with German precision to seal a fortress courtyard where 130 American soldiers now lay trapped like animals in a pen, pinned down by interlocking fields of MG-42 fire that raked the enclosed space from elevated positions, from murder holes and embrasures that turned every square foot of cobblestone into a killing zone where movement meant death and staying. Still meant dying slowly from grenades that German defenders dropped from above like presents from hell. And the rain that fell that gray November afternoon in 1944 mixed with blood on ancient stones as bullets sparked off walls and ricocheted in unpredictable angles that made even the act of breathing feel dangerous, made men press themselves so flat against whatever minimal cover existed that their uniforms absorbed mud and their faces scraped against rough stone. And every few seconds, another American soldier would cry out as a round found flesh or a grenade fragment opened an artery, and the battalion commander, a career officer who'd fought across France and thought he'd seen every tactical nightmare the war could produce, watched from a shattered window 200 yards back as his men died in that courtyard with no artillery support available because friendly forces were too close, no air support possible because weather had grounded every plane in the sector, no armor that could breach those walls without exposing itself to German anti-tank weapons. And the only route forward that made tactical sense led directly through that gate which the Germans had sealed from inside using mechanisms that American forces couldn't reach, couldn't blast open without killing their own men with the backblast, couldn't bypass because the fortress's position on high ground commanded the entire approach, and leaving it intact meant the entire offensive would stall here while men died for nothing in a stone courtyard that would become their mass grave unless someone figured out how to open that gate in the next few minutes before German reinforcements arrived, or the defenders simply massacred everyone trapped inside through methodical application of grenades and sustained machine gun fire. Staff Sergeant Henry Hank Wallace, a 32-year-old combat engineer from Pennsylvania who'd worked as a factory foreman before the war, who understood machines the way some men understood languages, who'd spent his entire adult life taking things apart and putting them back together, who carried a 2-foot adjustable wrench in his pack like other men carried Bibles or photos of sweethearts, who'd survived Normandy and the Hurtgen Forest by being smarter about explosives and engineering than the enemy, who had that peculiar combination of mechanical intuition and absolute fearlessness that made him invaluable in situations where conventional solutions failed, crawled through the rubble toward that gate while bullets kicked up stone chips around him and German voices shouted commands from above. And he didn't see an impenetrable barrier like everyone else saw, didn't see an engineering marvel that had defeated the assault, saw instead a mechanism with moving parts that obeyed physical laws, with stress points and failure modes, with components that could be exploited if you understood how they worked and were willing to get close enough to touch them while people actively tried to kill you. And this was the difference between Wallace and other engineers. He didn't just know how to blow things up, he understood how things were built, could read the intentions of the original designers in the placement of bolts and welds, could see where German engineering philosophy, that preference for overbuilt redundancy and methodical precision, created vulnerabilities that a more improvisational approach could exploit. The fortress had been built decades before the war, possibly centuries before depending on which stones you counted. A converted medieval structure that the Germans had reinforced with modern steel and concrete, transforming ancient defensive architecture into a 20th century strongpoint that controlled a critical road junction where 3 valleys met, where any advancing force had to either go through this position or detour 50 miles around it through terrain that was even worse. And the Germans knew this, which is why they'd invested so heavily in making it impregnable, why they'd positioned it as a linchpin in their defensive line, why losing it would open a gap that could be exploited all the way to the Rhine if American forces moved quickly enough. The gate itself represented the pinnacle of German defensive engineering. A massive steel wool mechanism on the inside that operated counterpressure locking bars which slid into recessed channels in the stone, creating a seal so tight that explosives applied from outside would simply deflect force rather than breach the barrier, and the wheel was positioned to be cranked from a protected alcove where defenders could lock and unlock the gate without exposing themselves to fire, and the entire system was over-engineered in that distinctly German way that prioritized reliability and strength over elegance, with redundant locking points and fail-safes that made it nearly impossible to force open through brute strength alone, and the Germans who designed it had probably congratulated themselves on creating an impregnable system, had probably run calculations proving it could withstand tank shells and demolition charges, had probably never considered that the very complexity they'd built into the mechanism, would become its greatest weakness when faced with someone who understood not just how to destroy it, but how to make it destroy itself. Wallace studied the gate from his position behind a dead German soldier whose body provided minimal cover, watched how bullets hitting the steel created vibration patterns that traveled through the metal, observed the way the locking wheel's edge was barely visible through a gap where the gate met the stone frame, noted the grease stains that suggested frequent use and maintenance, saw fresh scratches that indicated the Germans had been cycling the lock recently, probably checking it compulsively because they knew how critical it was to their defense. And his mind, trained through years of factory work where understanding mechanical systems meant the difference between meeting production quotas and getting fired, where reading stress patterns in metal was a survival skill that separated good foremen from ones who got workers killed in industrial accidents, began to piece together how the mechanism functioned, where its vulnerabilities lay, how the Germans' own over-engineering might contain the seeds of its defeat, how their insistence on redundant locking points meant that jamming the system at the right moment would create internal forces that would tear the mechanism apart from within rather than simply preventing it from opening. The tactical situation was deteriorating by the minute. In the courtyard, American infantry had taken cover behind anything available. Overturned carts, stone benches, a dry fountain that provided concealment if not actual protection. The bodies of men who'd been killed in the first minutes of the assault when they'd rushed the gate expecting it to be breachable with standard demolitions. But this cover was temporary and inadequate, providing concealment without protection, and German MG-42 teams fired in coordinated bursts that swept the space systematically, following doctrine that emphasized suppression through volume of fire at 1,200 rounds per minute, a rate so high that individual shots merged into a continuous tearing sound like the world's fabric being ripped apart, and between machine gun bursts came grenades, stick grenades that tumbled down from upper levels with their distinctive wooden handles spinning, and each explosion sent fragments bouncing off stones in patterns that made the entire courtyard a ricochet chamber where shrapnel found targets even behind cover, where the stone walls that should have protected became enablers of death as metal bounced and careened in unpredictable trajectories. Medics who tried to reach wounded men became casualties themselves. One was shot through the throat while applying a tourniquet. Another took a grenade fragment to the face while dragging a wounded sergeant toward cover. And ammunition was running low because the assault had expected to breach quickly and hadn't planned for a prolonged siege, hadn't brought enough bandoliers and belts for a sustained firefight, and officers who attempted to organize a coordinated movement or a retreat were immediately engaged by German marksmen who'd been positioned specifically to target anyone showing leadership, anyone giving orders or pointing or moving with purpose rather than the desperate scrambling that characterized trapped infantry, creating a situation where 130 men were effectively leaderless, scattered, unable to advance or retreat, unable even to coordinate their fire effectively because anyone who tried to direct others became a priority target, waiting to die unless something changed in the next few minutes before casualties mounted to the point where organized resistance became impossible and the Germans could simply walk down from their positions and accept surrenders from men too wounded or exhausted or demoralized to fight back. Wallace's plan formed in his mind with the clarity that comes from genuine expertise combined with desperate necessity. He would use the Germans' own mechanism against them, would exploit the very engineering that made the gate supposedly impregnable, would turn their over-designed locking system into a trap that would blow the gate inward rather than holding it shut. And the key was that adjustable wrench he carried, that tool which had saved his life a dozen times by allowing field repairs on equipment that kept breaking down under combat conditions, that implement which other engineers mocked as old-fashioned when powered tools existed but which Wallace preferred because it never ran out of batteries, never failed in cold weather, was simple enough that it couldn't break in ways that mattered, was heavy enough to serve as a weapon if necessary, and most importantly could serve as a lever, a hammer, a pry bar, or in this case a jamming device that could freeze a mechanism at the exact moment when freezing it would create maximum internal pressure in the locking system, would prevent the Germans from being able to resecure their gate while simultaneously building up forces within the mechanism that would make it vulnerable to properly placed explosives in ways the designers had never anticipated. He crawled closer to the gate, moving during the brief pauses when German gunners changed barrels or shifted targets, moving in small bursts that covered feet rather than yards, using the smoke from burning equipment as concealment, dragging his toolkit behind him because he knew he'd need more than just the wrench, would need wire cutters and pry bars and possibly his small sledgehammer, would need to improvise tools from battlefield debris, would need to work while under fire in conditions That would make even simple mechanical tasks nearly impossible. And as he moved, he watched the gate's behavior, noted that repeated bullet impacts were creating microshifts in the structure, were causing the locking wheel to rotate slightly with each heavy caliber round that struck near the mechanism, suggesting that the internal gears weren't perfectly locked, that there was play in the system, that the Germans' frequent use had worn components just enough to create the tiny vulnerabilities that an expert might exploit, that metal fatigue and repeated stress cycles had probably created microscopic cracks in critical components that wouldn't be visible but would be structurally significant, would be the difference between a mechanism that could withstand explosive force and one that would shatter under properly applied pressure. When Wallace reached the gate, he pressed himself against it, using the barrier itself as cover from the fire coming from above, and he could feel through the metal the vibrations of combat, could sense through his hands. Hands that had assembled machinery in factories, that had rebuilt truck engines under field conditions, that understood metal through touch the way musicians understand instruments. The stress patterns running through the structure, the points where force concentrated, where the locking mechanism was fighting against itself, where German defenders on the other side were probably trying to verify the lock was secure and were inadvertently creating exactly the internal stresses Wallace needed to exploit, and he saw what he needed to see. The locking wheel's edge protruding slightly from its housing, exposed just enough that a tool inserted at the right angle could engage it, could prevent it from rotating, could freeze the mechanism in a partially locked state where internal pressure would build rather than release, where the Germans' attempts to resecure the lock would actually work in Wallace's favor by applying force that would eventually tear their own mechanism apart from within. The wrench went in at an angle Wallace had calculated by eye, 15 degrees off perpendicular, angled downward to catch the wheel's teeth, positioned so that any attempt to turn the wheel clockwise would drive the wrench deeper into the mechanism rather than dislodging it, positioned so the tool's weight and the friction of grease-covered metal would hold it in place even under vibration from nearby explosions, and he used a broken rifle stock as a hammer to drive the wrench into position, pounding it with controlled strikes that were loud enough to make him wince because noise drew attention but necessary to seat the tool properly, to ensure it wouldn't slip or work loose, to drive it so deep into the mechanism that removing it would require tools the Germans probably didn't have readily available in their defensive position. And on the other side of the gate, he could hear German voices rising in confusion and alarm as defenders tried to operate the locking wheel and found it wouldn't move, found their mechanism jamming in ways their training hadn't prepared them for, found that cranking harder just made things worse, and Wallace could picture them on the far side. Soldiers cranking the wheel with increasing desperation, officers shouting orders in that clipped German way, someone probably running to get tools or a maintenance manual, mechanics or engineers being summoned to diagnose the problem, the slow dawning realization that their impregnable gate was malfunctioning at the worst possible moment, that the one thing that stood between them and American infantry was failing in ways that made no tactical sense because gates don't just break, mechanisms don't just jam, especially not German mechanisms that had been over-engineered specifically to prevent such failures. Wallace signaled to the nearest American soldier, a lieutenant who'd been pinned behind a stone water trough, a young officer who looked like he should still be in college rather than commanding men in combat, using hand gestures that communicated his plan in broad strokes. He needed the demolition team, needed specific placement of charges, needed coordination of the blast with what was about to happen with the gate mechanism, needed someone to understand that this wasn't going to be a standard breaching operation, but something more subtle, more dependent on timing and precision than on raw explosive force. And the lieutenant understood enough to crawl away through the chaos to find the engineers with their satchel charges and TNT while Wallace continued working on the gate, using wire cutters to remove a metal panel that provided access to part of the locking assembly, using his pry bar to increase pressure on internal components, essentially pre-stressing the mechanism so that when the explosion came, it would fail in a specific direction, inward toward the Germans, turning their defensive barrier into a weapon that would kill its own operators. And he worked with the methodical patience of a man who'd spent 20 years doing precision work, who understood that rushing mechanical tasks led to mistakes that could be fatal, who knew that doing it right the first time was faster than doing it wrong twice, even when doing it right meant spending extra seconds under fire while German machine guns searched for targets and grenades exploded close enough to shower him with stone fragments that a German stick grenade landed 3 feet from Wallace's position, tumbling end over end with that distinctive wooden handle making it unmistakable, and he had perhaps 2 seconds to react. Enough time to throw it back if he abandoned his work, enough time to curl into a protective position if he accepted failure, not enough time to both finish the jamming and survive the blast with certainty. and he made the decision that combat engineers make when expertise and duty intersect with mortal danger. He kept working, adjusted the wrench one final turn to ensure it wouldn't slip, verified with a quick tug that the tool was locked solid into the mechanism, and then curled around his toolkit as the grenade detonated with a crack that felt like being hit by a truck, that sent shrapnel through his left shoulder and leg, that filled his mouth with the taste of blood and cordite, that left his ears ringing so badly he couldn't hear the German machine guns anymore, though he could feel their bullets hitting the gate, and the pain was immediate and overwhelming but also weirdly distant because adrenaline and shock were already numbing his nervous system, already prioritizing survival over suffering, already flooding his system with endorphins and other chemicals that would let him function for a few more minutes before his body shut down. And he looked at his work through vision that was starting to tunnel and saw that the wrench had held, saw that the mechanism was jammed exactly as he'd intended, saw that blood from his wounds was mixing with the grease on the metal, but the tool remained solidly wedged in the locking wheel, and he gave a thumbs-up signal to the lieutenant who'd returned with the demolition team because he couldn't speak, couldn't trust his voice not to reveal the extent of his injuries, couldn't let anyone know he might be dying because then they'd try to save him instead of finishing the job, and the job was more important than one engineer's life when 130 men were depending on that gate opening in the next few minutes. The demolition team worked with the practiced efficiency of men who'd blown through doors and walls across half of Europe, placing shaped charges at stress points Wallace indicated with pointing fingers because his voice still wasn't working right, using det cord to link the charges so they'd blow simultaneously, setting timers for 30 seconds, which was barely enough to get clear, but Wallace insisted on short fuses because the Germans were attempting to force their locking wheel, and every second increased the chance they'd succeed in clearing the jam or someone would spot the charges and cut the wires, and when the engineers ran back to cover, Wallace tried to crawl, but his legs weren't responding properly, and he realized with detached clarity that the grenade had done more damage than he'd initially assessed, had probably severed something important in his lower back or hips, had cut nerves or damaged his spine in ways that would require surgery if he survived, and a corporal couldn't have been more than 19 years old, fresh-faced despite the mud and blood, grabbed Wallace's webgear and dragged him backward toward the dubious protection of a stone column, while bullets sparked around them and German voices screamed warnings because someone had spotted the charges, had seen the det cord and TNT and understood what was about to happen. And Wallace counted seconds in his head because his watch crystal had been shattered by shrapnel and time was measured now only by the beating of his heart, which felt irregular and too fast. 26, 27, 28. And when the count reached 30, the world transformed into fire and pressure and sound that was less heard than felt as a physical force that collapsed lungs and stopped hearts as the carefully placed charges detonated in perfect synchronization and directed their explosive force not outward but inward through the gate's own structure, following the path of least resistance which Wallace had engineered by jamming the locking mechanism at precisely the point where internal forces would concentrate, where the Germans' own design would funnel destruction back through the barrier they'd built to withstand it, where redundant locking points became structural weaknesses, where over-engineering became catastrophic failure. The gate didn't just blow open. It betrayed its makers, twisted inward with tortured metal screaming as medieval stone met modern explosives and lost, as locking bars that should have distributed force evenly instead became projectiles that tore through the alcove where German defenders had thought themselves safe, where the gun crews had positioned themselves believing the gate would protect them, as the massive steel will Wallace had jammed came free under explosive pressure and became a circular saw that bounced through the defender's position with the weight and momentum to cut men in half, to crush skulls, to turn bodies into broken things that barely looked human, and the blast wave that should have dissipated outward instead funneled through the fortress's entrance corridor like a shaped charge, creating overpressure that ruptured lungs and burst eardrums and concussed brains, that killed men without leaving visible wounds, that turned the defensive architecture into a killing funnel that worked in reverse, and the smoke and dust that followed obscured everything in a gray fog that turned defenders into shadows stumbling in confusion while American infantry, who'd been ready for this moment, surged forward through the breach with the desperate energy of men who'd thought they were dead and had suddenly been given a chance to live, who'd been pinned and helpless and now saw opportunity, who channeled fear and rage and relief into forward momentum that carried them through the shattered gate and into the fortress where German defenders were still reeling from the blast, still trying to understand how their impregnable position had just been breached. The assault through the gate lasted less than 3 minutes but felt eternal to the men who fought it. Room-to-room combat where visibility was measured in feet, where every corner could hide an enemy, where grenades preceded infantry into each space, where riflemen fired at shadows and hoped they were shooting Germans rather than civilians or fellow Americans, where the Germans' own fortress design with its narrow corridors and defensive positions became a maze of death for defenders who'd prepared to fight outward but found themselves fighting inward instead, who'd planned to use superior position and fortification but found themselves trapped in stone rooms with no retreat, with no way to fall back to secondary positions because American infantry was already in the corridors blocking withdrawal routes. And the surrender came in clusters as isolated pockets of defenders realized their position had become untenable, as officers who'd been trained to hold at all costs recognized that holding meant dying for a gate that no longer existed, as enlisted men threw down weapons and raised hands and hoped the Americans were in a mood to take prisoners rather than exact revenge for the men who died in that courtyard, and most Americans were willing to accept surrenders because they were too exhausted for more killing, too relieved at surviving to want more violence. Though there were exceptions, there are always exceptions in combat when men have watched friends die and want someone to pay. The silence after combat is always strange, always disorienting. As ears that had been assaulted by constant noise struggle to process the absence of gunfire. As minds that had been operating on pure adrenaline begin to process what happened and what it cost. And in that silence Wallace lay against a stone column where the corporal had dragged him, bleeding from wounds that needed immediate treatment, going into shock as his body began to shut down non-essential systems in a desperate attempt to preserve core functions, and he looked at his wrench. Still gripped in his hand, though he didn't remember picking it up, covered in blood and grease and stone dust, bent slightly from the explosive forces it had been subjected to, and thought about how strange it was that this tool, this simple mechanical implement that had cost maybe $3 in a hardware store in Pennsylvania before the war, had just killed dozens of German soldiers and saved 130 Americans and changed the outcome of an assault that would determine whether the offensive continued or stalled. And he tried to clean the wrench on his uniform because old habits die hard, and he'd always maintained his tools properly. Had always believed that a craftsman was defined by how he treated his equipment, but his hands weren't cooperating and a medic was suddenly there pushing him flat and cutting away his uniform to expose wounds, and Wallace heard the medic curse, which probably meant things were bad, but the medic's hands were steady and professional as he packed wounds and tied tourniquets and jabbed morphine into Wallace's thigh, and other soldiers were moving past now, continuing the assault deeper into the fortress, stepping over German bodies and through the wreckage of the gate that lay twisted and broken like the skeleton of some mechanical beast that had been killed by its own strength turned against it, and Wallace watched them go and felt satisfaction that his work had been good, had been sufficient, had solved the problem that needed solving even if it had cost him blood and possibly the use of his legs. The after-action report filed 3 days later by a battalion intelligence officer would describe the breach as successful employment of combat engineering assets, resulting in neutralization of fortified position with minimal friendly casualties considering the tactical situation, which was military bureaucracy's way of reducing 4 minutes of chaos and violence and desperate improvisation into language that could be filed and forgotten, that transformed Wallace's wrench and his understanding of mechanical systems and his willingness to work under fire while wounded into a checkbox on a form. Though the report did note that unconventional methods employed by engineering personnel were critical to mission success, which was perhaps the closest thing to genuine praise that official military documentation could manage, and buried in the appendices was a technical description of the jamming technique that Wallace had improvised, written in dry language that made it sound like a planned operation rather than desperate field expedient invented by a bleeding man who was running out of time. Wallace spent 6 weeks recovering in a field hospital, underwent 3 surgeries to remove shrapnel and repair damage to his spine and hip, relearned how to walk through physical therapy that was as painful as the original wounds, that required him to push through agony every day as doctors and nurses forced him to use damaged legs that screamed protest with every step, and eventually returned to duty, though not to frontline engineering because doctors decided his back wouldn't hold up to crawling through rubble and carrying heavy loads, wouldn't withstand the physical demands of combat engineering even though Wallace insisted he was fine, insisted he could do the job, but medical officers overruled him and he finished the war doing rear echelon work that he found boring but necessary, training younger engineers on improvised tactics and field expedient solutions to problems that couldn't be solved through standard procedures, teaching them to see mechanisms rather than barriers, to understand that every defensive structure contains vulnerabilities if you know how to look for them, And he never talked much about the gate even when other soldiers asked, because in his mind he'd just done his job, had applied mechanical knowledge under difficult circumstances, hadn't done anything particularly heroic, but had simply recognized that gates are machines and machines can be manipulated if you understand their operating principles, if you know where stress concentrates, where force can be redirected, where the designer's assumptions become weaknesses. After the war, Wallace returned to Pennsylvania, returned to factory work and civilian life, married a woman who'd waited for him and never really understood what he'd done in France beyond the vague details in letters that army censors had allowed through. Raised 3 children who grew up knowing their father had been an engineer in the war but not knowing the specifics because Wallace didn't talk about it, didn't attend veteran reunions, didn't join the VFW or participate in Memorial Day parades, just went to work every day and came home and maintained his house and his car and his tools with the same methodical precision he'd applied to maintaining his equipment during the war, and he kept that wrench. Still blood-stained in places where cleaning couldn't reach, still bearing the scratches and dents from impact with German steel, still bent slightly from explosive forces, still functional because good tools last if you maintain them, in his garage toolbox where it sat among other implements, distinguished from them only by the small tag Wallace attached that read France 44, in pencil that faded over decades but never completely disappeared, and sometimes when he worked on machinery in his garage, he'd use that wrench and remember 4 minutes in November when understanding mechanical systems had been the difference between life and death. For 130 men, when a simple tool had become a weapon more effective than any rifle or grenade, when German engineering had been defeated not by superior technology but by someone who understood machines well enough to make them betray their makers.